The snow had come early that year, thick and heavy, falling like sifted flour from the sky's gray belly. It blanketed the land in silence, muffling hooves, wind, and memory alike. The plains of Wyoming stretched in every direction, a sea of white broken only by the skeletal reach of cottonwoods and the trembling breath of old barns. In that hush of a world, a man named Emery Cade walked the edge of survival and the edge of himself. He was not young, not yet old, somewhere in that strange space where time creases the eyes but not the hands. His face was weathered, not cruel, marked by years of wind, loss, and work. His cabin sat low against a hill like a man trying not to be noticed. Smoke from its chimney curled slowly into the pale air. Inside, a dog named Birch stirred only when Emery returned from the woods, boots crusted with snow, silence clinging to him like a second coat. The death of his wife, Miriam, had stolen the color from his world. 3 winters passed, and still he moved as though the air was too thick to breathe. He worked the land because the land didn't ask questions. The cattle were gone, the fences half-built, but the woodpile was tall and the roof sound, and that, he told himself, was enough. He spoke little, not because he couldn't, but because there was no one left to listen. This morning, though, was different. The wind carried the scent before the sky betrayed it. Smoke, bitter and wrong, the kind that doesn't rise from a hearth. Emery paused, hand on the reins of his mule, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. In the north, a dark smear smeared the sky where it should have been pearl and frost. A wagon train, maybe, or what remained of one. His mule shifted under him, uneasy. Emery clicked his tongue and moved on, following the trail that wound through the birch woods, every step a whisper in the snow. He had no debt to settle with anyone, no reason to ride toward fire. But something beneath his ribs stirred, a dull throb that memory alone could not explain. By the time he reached the valley, the smoke had thinned, but the wreckage told its story. 3 wagons, burned down to their bones. Ash fluttered in the wind like dead feathers. One body lay sprawled, half covered in snow. Another slumped against a wheel, hands blackened and stiff. A woman's scarf, bright crimson, fluttered from a splintered post like a signal or a wound. He moved slowly, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for movement, for survivors or shadows. The Comanche had likely moved on, quick as fire and just as unforgiving. No sense in chasing ghosts. But then, he heard it. A sound so soft it could have been the wind's trickery. A cough. Weak. Human. Emery dropped to a crouch, following the sound to a fallen log near the brush line. She was there. Curled like a child, face bruised, lips blue, hair tangled with ice. Her dress was scorched on one side. A torn glove clung to her hand. He thought, for a breath, she might be dead. But then her eyes opened, gray like a storm just off the coast, full of a kind of fear he hadn't seen in years. She did not speak. She only looked at him, as if unsure whether he was real or one more shadow in a world gone cold. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low, steady. She blinked once. Tried to rise. Failed. He slipped his arms beneath her with a practiced gentleness. She weighed little, less than she should. The dog trotted from the woods behind him, whining softly. Emery glanced at the burnt wagons, then at her. "Let's go," he muttered to neither of them. Back at the cabin, the fire roared high. He'd banked it before leaving, not knowing he'd return with more than kindling. He laid her gently on the cot near the stove, covered her in wool, gave her water in slow sips. She shivered through the first hour, teeth chattering, eyes closed tight. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. There were too many answers neither of them were ready to offer. She woke fully by evening. Spoke little, voice soft and clipped. Her accent was foreign, not just to these plains, but to this land. She said her name was Isla Hoffman, a widow, traveling west with family to start again. Raiders had come without warning. She'd run, hidden, prayed. Emery listened, nodded when needed, didn't press. Not because he believed her, something about the way she said her name, like it didn't belong to her, but because he understood the need to protect the past from the present. The dog curled beside her cot. She stroked its fur absent-mindedly, eyes unfocused. He made stew. Thick, simple. She ate slowly, spoon trembling. "You live alone?" she asked finally. "I do." "Long?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Long enough." She didn't ask more. That night, he sat in the chair by the fire, boots off, eyes half-lidded. She slept in the cot, face turned to the wall. Snow tapped the windows like a child begging entrance. Birch snored softly between them. Outside, the world turned quiet again. But inside, something had shifted. She stayed through the next day. And the next. She tried to help, rising from the cot though her body begged her not to. She swept the floors, wiped down the stove. Emery watched her with a strange reverence, like a man who hadn't seen a storm break in so long he'd forgotten what color the sky became afterward. She was not soft in the way some women were. Her fingers were pale but calloused, her gaze steady but kind. When she spoke, her voice held a gravity that betrayed education, history, and careful restraint. One evening, as he chopped wood outside, she stepped onto the porch. The wind tugged her dress and flushed her cheeks. "You saved me," she said. He paused, looked up from the log. "Did what needed doing." She tilted her head. "Why?" He looked past her, to the hills now bathed in dusklight. His voice was quiet. "Could have been my wife once. Could have been anybody. Just seemed wrong to leave you there." Her face softened, not into a smile, but something gentler, like frost beginning to melt under a tentative sun. Inside, the fire burned down low. The cabin breathed with warmth, with life again. That night, she slept deeper. Emery stood outside long after the stars came out. He looked up at them like they might answer something. The kind of man who didn't wish often, because he'd learned not to expect wishes to land. But tonight, he let himself feel the small ache of possibility. Somewhere in the vast dark sky, a baroness with a false name lay sleeping in a cabin built by grief. And a widower, who'd sworn never to let the world back in, found himself listening to the sound of her breath, steady now, like hope waking for the first time in years. And though he didn't know it yet, that breath would change everything. Morning broke not with brilliance, but with a dull, gray hush that pressed against the windows like a held breath. Snow still fell in slow spirals, not fierce, but persistent, a soft reminder that winter had no intention of loosening its grip. Inside the cabin, warmth pulsed from the cast-iron stove, filling the room with the scent of pine smoke and simmering oats. The woman, Isla, if that was truly her name, sat wrapped in a wool shawl, spoon in hand, her face less pale than it had been, but far from well. Emery moved with quiet purpose, adding more wood to the fire, checking the door latch, pouring hot water into a chipped basin. His presence was like gravity, silent, solid, inescapable. He said little, but nothing in his silence was unkind. It was the silence of a man who had long made peace with being alone, who no longer expected conversation to be currency. "You don't ask much," Isla said softly, setting her bowl aside. Her voice still carried that elegant tension, as though trained not to tremble, but her eyes gave her away. They searched for something stable, something that wouldn't vanish like everything else had. Emery looked up from his chair, rubbed his hands together slowly. "Figured you'd talk when you were ready." She gave a faint nod, then looked to the window, where snow clung thick to the corners of the glass. "I don't know what to do next." "Rest," he said simply. "Eat. Mend." "I didn't mean just now." "I did." He returned to his task. A piece of leather torn at the edge, mended slowly with thick thread and careful hands. Isla watched him for a while. There was a stillness to him, not born of laziness or reluctance, but of deliberation. Like everything he did had weight. She had grown up in a world where men moved like storms, loud, rushed, destructive in their certainties. Emery was different. He moved like a tree might grow, slow, firm, and without need of permission. That afternoon, she tried sweeping again. The motion hurt, her side still tender from the fall, but she did it anyway. Emery didn't stop her, though he watched her movements closely, like a man who'd known too much loss to let injury sneak in unnoticed. By dusk, they sat across from one another at the table. The meal was simple: beans, salt pork, dark bread hard enough to crack a tooth if you weren't careful. Emery passed her the tin mug of coffee without a word. She took it with both hands. "My family used to drink tea," she murmured. "Silver teapots. Always had lemon, never cream." He raised an eyebrow. "Can't say I've tasted either." She smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in memory. "This is better, somehow. More honest." He didn't reply, but something in the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but something close. She wondered how long it had been since anyone had looked him in the eye without expectation. Later that evening, she wandered the cabin with slow steps. It was small but carefully kept. A few carvings on a shelf, a horse, a mountain lion, a bird with wings spread mid-flight. All made from the same pale wood. Birch, likely. There were no photographs. Just a single yellowing piece of embroidery framed in wood above the hearth. It read, "Even winter has its quiet songs." "That hers?" she asked gently, pointing to the embroidery. Emery nodded without looking up from his book. "Miriam. My wife. I'm sorry." He closed the book, thumb holding the place. "She made peace with things quicker than I did." That line was hers. Said it the night before she passed. Isla lowered her gaze. "It's beautiful." "She was," he said, and then left it at that. In the following days, she began to heal, both in body and manner. The tremble in her hands lessened. Her voice steadied. Still, she kept her true name buried like a coin beneath snow. There was safety in being Isla. Baroness Isolde von Hohenberg had no place here among ash and wood smoke. They fell into a rhythm, unspoken but shared. She mended clothes. He hunted rabbits. She cleaned the stovepipe while he salted venison strips by the back door. Each task a small conversation, each moment of eye contact a question neither asked aloud. Emery showed her how to stack wood properly, bark side out, tight like teeth. When she dropped a log on her boot and cursed under her breath in German, he didn't flinch. Just said, "That your home tongue?" She paused. "It was. Don't hear it often round here." "I don't say it often anymore." He nodded, accepting the answer without prying. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, the dog at their feet and snow drifting thick past the windows, Emery said, "What did you do before?" "Before what?" "Before everything changed." She stirred the tea he'd made from dried mint leaves. "I listened. I smiled when I didn't want to. I sat in rooms filled with men who talked about borders and horses and oil while pretending I wasn't there. And I danced." "Sounds exhausting." She laughed softly. "It was. You." He tilted his head. "Built this place. Fenced in 30 acres. Raised cattle, until the sickness came through. Buried a dog. Then a wife. Then the rest just blurred. For a while, they let the silence return. But it no longer felt sharp. It rested between them like a shared coat against the cold. One morning, a figure appeared along the trail from town. Old Mason, wrapped in buffalo hide, riding a mule that looked older than its rider. He carried supplies, letters from the post, and a look that said he didn't miss much. Mason stepped into the cabin and immediately turned toward Isla. "Well now," he said in that gravel-dusted voice, "either Emery's taken up carving angels or I've walked into a dream." She smiled, extending a hand. "Isla." "Pleasure, miss. I'm Mason. Known Emery here since he had fewer scars and more cows." Emery chuckled once, rare and warm. They sat for coffee, and Mason filled the space with stories and half-lies, most of which made Isla smile. As he left, he tipped his hat toward her and said to Emery with a wink, "Glad to see the hearth lit again." That night, Emery carved another bird. His hands moved slowly, carefully, smoothing the wings until they looked ready to lift. He didn't say it was for her, but she found it on her cot the next morning, resting on a folded scrap of linen. The shape was imperfect but tender, the beak slightly crooked, the feathers traced with patience. She held it for a long time, then placed it on the windowsill, facing east. Emery came in from the cold, carrying a rabbit and the smell of frost. He glanced at the windowsill, then at her. She nodded once. Outside, the wind picked up. A flurry danced past the window. The season wasn't easing, not yet. But inside the cabin, the cold had begun to shift. Not gone, but gentler. Isla stirred the stew, the wooden spoon turning in lazy circles. "You think the snow ever really leaves?" Emery sat by the fire, stretching his hands out to the warmth. "No. But it stops meaning the same thing." She didn't ask what he meant. She understood. Loss didn't melt. It just changed shape. When she turned, he was watching her, not with hunger or pity, but with something quieter. Recognition, maybe, or respect. She smiled, soft and unsure. And for the first time in many years, Emery smiled back. The storm rolled in as though summoned from memory. Gray clouds coiling over the ridgeline, shadows deepening with every hour. Snow returned, not in gentle flurries but in great swathes, whipping sideways across the valley, erasing tracks and silencing the trees. The wind keened through the branches like a grieving voice, a sound that seemed to crawl inside the walls of Emery Cade's cabin and settle in the corners. He had felt it coming before it appeared. A tightness in his knees. The kind of ache that tells a man the sky is about to break. By noon, the trail to town had vanished beneath white drifts, and by evening, even the window panes were frosted with thick veils that blurred the world outside to nothing. They were snowed in. Inside, the cabin crackled with warmth, the stove fed to a red glow, the walls lined with shadows that flickered like dancers. Emery and Isla moved carefully through the hours, navigating around each other with a quiet understanding. The storm had sealed them together like ink to parchment. She sat cross-legged near the hearth, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a tin cup of steeped herbs cradled between her palms. Her eyes were darker than usual. Rested, yes, but distant in a way that said the past was stirring behind them. Emery sat across from her, sharpening a blade with slow, methodical strokes. The only sounds were the rasp of metal, the hush of the wind, and the occasional pop of burning pine. She spoke first. Her voice was even, as if she were reading from a book she had memorized long ago. "My real name isn't Isla." Emery paused. The blade in his hand stilled mid-stroke. He didn't look up right away, just set the knife aside and leaned forward to feed another log to the fire. "I figured," he said quietly. She blinked, caught off guard. "You did." "I'm not a fool," he murmured, settling back into his chair. "A woman like you doesn't end up out here without reason. The way you talk, the way you hold yourself. You've been around things I haven't." She let out a breath that was half relief, half sorrow. "I thought I'd buried it all." "Maybe you did. But the ground's shallow when the wind kicks up." She stared into the flames for a long moment, watching them lick the iron grate. Then she began again, softer now. "My name is Isolde. Isolde von Hohenberg." He didn't flinch, only nodded once. "I was born to a world where names came before souls, where titles meant more than kindness. My father was a baron, my mother a count's daughter. We lived in a house with mirrors on every wall, chandeliers that never collected dust, servants who bowed more than they breathed. I was dressed in silks I didn't choose, taught languages I would never speak to those who mattered. And I was told that one day I would marry power. Not love, power." The fire cracked loudly, as if punctuating her words. "I tried to escape it once. I was 17. I hid in the stables, rode out past the orchards until the sky went black. They found me by morning and said nothing, but after that I was watched. My meals were counted, my letters read. And when I turned 20, they told me I was to be sent to a man twice my age, a duke in Prussia, who'd promised land in exchange for a fertile wife." She sipped from the cup, but it trembled now. "So I ran again. This time farther. I took a ship, disguised myself, used a servant's name, paid men to forget me. I thought if I could just reach the West, where no one cared who I was, I could start as someone else." "And you almost did," Emery said, his voice a whisper, like a leaf turned over by wind. Her eyes found him. I don't expect forgiveness. Not for the lies. But I didn't want to be rescued as someone I'm not. He shook his head. You were someone worth saving, no matter the name. That silenced her more deeply than shame. Her hands fell to her lap, still holding the empty cup, her fingers curled tightly around the handle. She looked down. And you? What's left of you that hasn't been carved away? He smiled then, faint and worn. Not much. A name. A dog. A few fence posts. Tell me about her, Isolde said. Your wife. He exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been waiting to be asked for years. Then he began. She was small, wild, in her way. Miriam. Laughed at everything. At the birds, at my clumsy boots, at how I'd burn coffee no matter how careful I was. She grew up in Tennessee but had eyes like she came from oceans. She wanted to see everything, but never made it past these hills. Said the sky here was wide enough. What happened? He looked into the flames. Winter. Fever. Came on fast, like a storm behind the eyes. One day she was laughing at the dog chewing her boot, and the next she couldn't stand. I sat by her bed until she stopped breathing. She never made a sound. Just faded. Isolde reached across the space between them, her fingers brushing his wrist. Not a grip. Not a plea. Just presence. Human warmth meeting another. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I, he said. Still am. They sat there, firelight casting long shadows up their faces, eyes lit not just by flame but by shared understanding. Outside, the wind shrieked and moaned, but the cabin held. Later that night, when sleep came for her, Isolde dreamed of staircases made of smoke and voices calling her by names she no longer wanted. She woke with a gasp, hand clutching her chest, and found Emery still at the fire, carving a piece of wood she hadn't seen before. A bird, he said without looking up. Don't know why. Just came to me. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't move away. She watched his hands work the blade over the grain, slow, careful. You carve like you're healing something, she said. Maybe I am. Do you believe people can start over? He stopped, turned the piece of wood in his palm. I don't know, he said. But I think we can choose better, second time around. She nodded, then leaned her head gently against his shoulder. They sat that way until dawn teased the edges of the sky. In the days that followed, they settled into a silence that was no longer guarded. She told him about the gardens back home, where nothing grew wild. He told her about the hills where he first kissed Miriam, too shy to meet her eyes. She laughed at that. Not cruelly, but with a warmth that made him laugh too. One evening, she found a fiddle in a trunk under his bed. It was old, missing a string, the wood dulled from years untouched. She held it gently, running her fingers across its ribs. You play. Used to. Will you? He shook his head. Not anymore. Why not? Because she did. Isolde didn't push. She only nodded and set it back in the trunk, as if tucking away a memory not hers to disturb. But that night, as the fire dwindled to embers, she heard it. Faint at first, a low hum, a single trembling note. Then another. Emery, seated by the stove, fiddle tucked awkwardly under his chin, bow trembling as it moved. The sound was cracked, hesitant, but true. She didn't speak, just watched. When he finished, he looked up, eyes shining in the low light. I thought I forgot, he said. You didn't, she replied. You just hadn't remembered in a while. The storm broke the next morning. The sky split into 1,000 shades of blue, the clouds retreating like a tide drawn back. Snow still blanketed the ground, but the wind had calmed, and the world gleamed as if made new. They stepped outside together, boots crunching softly beneath them. The trees sparkled with frost, and the hills glowed under the soft morning sun. Emery turned toward her, one hand resting on the porch post, the other tucked into his coat. What now? He asked. She looked out over the snow-silvered land, hair glinting in the pale light. I think, she said, we keep waking up. One day at a time. He nodded. And as they stood there, shoulder to shoulder in the still morning, a kind of peace settled over them. Not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of being known and not turning away. And somewhere inside that silence, a future began to hum. The days lengthened just enough to hint at the coming thaw, though winter still held the land in its crooked fingers. Snow melted along the eaves, dripping rhythmically, the sound like a slow clock ticking inside Emery's chest. In the cabin, warmth had grown beyond the fire. Something lived in the way he and his soul moved now. Not hurried, not uncertain. Just side by side, as though the house had finally settled around two instead of one. They worked with a silent rhythm that made the smallest tasks feel like something sacred. She swept the floors with careful attention. He mended tools with quiet purpose. They shared coffee in the early hours before the sun reached over the hills. Spoke little but looked often. The silence between them no longer demanded to be filled. It held meaning of its own. But even in that peace, there was an undercurrent. A feeling not yet named, but coiling in the shadows just beyond the walls. It arrived on horseback. The man came from the west, his coat dusted with road and his hat pulled low. He rode a black gelding with a white blaze across its nose and wore the kind of look that didn't ask questions because it already knew answers. He came into Stillwater quietly, took a room at the tavern, drank nothing, and spent his hours reading folded paper by the fire. His name was Martin Eckhart. He was not a sheriff or a bounty hunter in title, but he had the air of both. Men like him didn't ask for justice. They arrived already believing it was theirs to deliver. He carried no badge, but the revolver on his hip was well-oiled, and the boots he wore had walked further than most horses ever had. It wasn't long before he asked after a woman. Said she was traveling with a small party east of the Rockies, possibly under another name. European. Well-spoken. Missing, not by accident. The barkeep, always one to lean toward a good story, told him of a snowbound widow taken in by a local settler. Keeps to himself, the man said. Lost his wife some time back. Hard man, fair heart. Got a cabin out near Pike Ridge. Eckhart nodded once. Said thank you. Left a coin on the counter like it was a gravestone. 2 days later, Emery found the man waiting outside the general store, horse tied neatly to the post, coat collar turned high. He stepped into Emery's path as naturally as breath, offered a nod, then a question wrapped in pleasantry. You Emery Cade? Emery studied him a long moment. I am. You got a woman up in that cabin with you? That your business? The man smiled without warmth. Name's Martin Eckhart. I've been paid to find someone. Her family worries she's taken up with trouble. They say she might be using another name. Emery didn't blink. If I had a woman in my house, that'd be because she chose to be there. Eckhart's smile remained, but his eyes cooled. You tell her a man came by, then. You tell her the world's looking for her. Emery didn't reply. He stepped past him without further word, but his shoulders were tight, and his jaw set hard. Back at the cabin, he found her in the yard, stacking wood with her sleeves rolled. The snow had thinned around the house, revealing patches of earth like old wounds. She looked up as he approached and saw it on his face before he spoke. What is it? Someone came looking, he said. Asking about you. Her hands dropped to her sides. The blood drained from her face. Who? Called himself Eckhart. Said he was sent by your family. She swallowed hard, her breath catching. Did he say my name? No, Emery said. But he didn't need to. The way he spoke, he knew. He'll come again. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she turned and walked toward the porch, sitting down on the top step with her arms wrapped around her knees. I can't go back, she said. You have to understand that. I do. They'll turn me into something I'm not. Again. That life, it's not a life. It's a cage built from gold. He sat beside her. The dog wandered up, rested its head on Isolde's knee. What do you want to do? He asked. She looked at the horizon. Run, maybe. Head south. Cross into New Mexico. Start again. Again. Emery was quiet. Then he said, "You won't have to do it alone." That night, they packed quietly, gathering food, tools, spare boots, and blankets. Emery fetched the old saddle from the barn and tested the cinch with practiced hands. Isolde folded her few belongings, a comb, a scarf, the carved bird he had made, and placed them in a canvas bag. By lamplight, she traced the edge of a folded map, her finger moving along trails she had never traveled. She paused over a name, Stillwater Ridge. "There's a canyon pass," she whispered. "We could be across by tomorrow if we leave early." He nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "What if we didn't run?" She looked at him. "What if we faced him? Told him you're not going anywhere unless it's your choosing?" She hesitated. "And if he doesn't care?" Emery's eyes didn't waver. "Then he'll learn he's not the only one who can stand his ground." The next morning, they woke before dawn. Snow still clung to the trees in hard patches, but the wind had shifted. The first breath of spring lingered faintly on the air. They were ready to leave when they heard the hoofbeats. Eckhart came alone, just as before, but this time he did not stop at the porch. He rode up with the confidence of a man who'd already made his decision. Isolde stepped out before Emery could speak. Her coat hung open, her hair tied back in a rough knot, eyes clear and steady. "I'm not going with you," she said. Eckhart looked her over with the calm disdain of a man studying a cracked statue. "I've been paid to bring you back. Alive. Not happy. You can tell them I died," she said. "That would be close enough to the truth." He dismounted. Emery stepped forward, hand resting loosely at his side. "You'll leave now," Emery said, "or you'll regret staying." Eckhart didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. But he smiled again, that same smile, cold and controlled. "You'd raise arms against the law?" "There's no law here," Emery replied. "Just men. And their choices." For a moment, it seemed it might come to violence. The wind held its breath. Even the birds fell quiet. Then Eckhart spat into the snow and turned away. "I'll return," he said. "You think hiding here makes you free? There's always someone willing to trade you back." He mounted his horse, eyes on Emery. "One day, you'll have to choose what matters most." "I already have," Emery said. And with that, Eckhart rode off into the trees. They didn't speak for a while after he vanished. Isolde stood motionless until her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the porch. Emery stood beside her, the rifle unused but ready. Eventually, she said, "You could have let me go. You didn't have to stand with me." "I didn't have to," he said. "But I wanted to." She looked up at him, her eyes full of questions that had no answers yet. "I'm not who I was," she whispered. He sat beside her, hand brushing lightly against hers. "Neither am I." Night fell early, cloaking the cabin in darkness. The fire inside glowed steady and warm, untouched by the chill outside. The map still lay open on the table, trails winding toward places unknown. They hadn't left. Not yet. But they were no longer hiding. Emery sharpened his knife slowly, methodically. The sound echoed through the room like a heartbeat. Isolde stood at the window, watching stars emerge one by one in the sky. "When we leave," she said, "I want to choose the road, not flee it." He nodded. "We will." The dog stretched and curled back into sleep by the hearth. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, no longer howling, just whispering like it knew change had already begun. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a path waited, one that would not be easy, but would be theirs alone. The morning they left, the sky was the color of steel, unmoving, unblinking, a great ceiling pressing low over the land. They rose before the sun, packed their things in silence, and saddled the horses with slow, practiced hands. Birch whined once, sensing the change, pacing the porch as Emery cinched the last strap. Isolde stood with the map folded in her gloved hand, her face unreadable but pale with resolve. The cabin sat behind them like an old friend watching their backs. Emery didn't look over his shoulder as they set out. He'd said his goodbye in the way he'd banked the fire for the last time, in the careful way he'd closed the door without slamming it. The path ahead was narrow, winding through snow-laced pine, leading toward the canyon trail that would drop them south, toward Stillwater Ridge and the roads that branched out like veins into the territories beyond. They did not speak much as they rode. The air was sharp, biting at their cheeks. The wind moved in soft hushes, curling around trees like it was trying to listen. Isolde sat straight in her saddle, her eyes forward, her hands steady. She did not look back either. Whatever waited behind her had been left there with her name and the life it carried. By mid-morning, they reached the ridgeline. The view opened like a wound, miles of white stretching into distant gold hills, the far south glimpsed as a thread of color against the horizon. The pass below coiled between jagged stone and dark trees, narrow and treacherous, but open. If they could reach the canyon floor before nightfall, they'd be safe. Emery slowed his horse. Isolde pulled alongside him. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice quiet as falling snow. She met his eyes. "I've never been more sure of anything." He nodded once. That was all. But something in the air shifted then. A sound. A silence too sudden. Birch's ears perked, and he gave a low growl from where he trotted behind. Emery's hand went instinctively to the rifle strapped across his saddle. Then came the movement. 3 riders, emerging from the tree line to the west, their forms like ink stains against the pale snow. They moved fast, tight formation, trained. Not wild Comanche or scattered raiders. These were professionals. One of them raised a hand. Martin Eckhart. He wore the same calm expression as before, but there was no smile this time, only precision. His coat billowed slightly with his pace. The 2 men flanking him rode with rifles drawn. Emery muttered under his breath. "They followed us." Isolde's jaw clenched. He said he would. They had no time to turn back. The slope down into the canyon was steep but passable, if they could reach it first. Emery wheeled his horse. "Go." Isolde hesitated. "Now," he barked, and she spurred forward, her horse lunging into motion. The path was narrow, rocks jutting out at cruel angles, patches of snow crusted over black ice. Emery rode behind her, close, scanning the ridge above for movement. Eckhart's men split, one cutting to the right, trying to flank. The other stayed behind him, rifles swinging into place. A shot rang out. Snow exploded to Emery's left, bark splintering from a tree. He didn't return fire. Not yet. Not until he could draw them farther down, away from the ridge. The path turned sharp, and he called out to Isolde, "To the ravine. Take the narrow cut. You remember it." She didn't answer, but she veered left at the next split, ducking under a low branch, the sound of hooves hammering the earth behind her. The wind screamed as it funneled through the pass, howling against stone. Another shot, closer this time. Her horse reared but kept steady. Emery swung his rifle up, fired once, clean, controlled. The man behind him yelped, slid from his saddle, his body hitting the snow like a felled deer. Eckhart kept coming. He didn't shoot. Not yet. He was saving something. Waiting. They reached the bottom of the ravine just as the sun crested the edge of the world, bathing the canyon floor in gold and shadow. The trees grew denser here, pines rising like cathedral columns on either side. The snow thinned, revealing patches of earth, and their pace quickened. Isolde rode like she was born to it, her hair streaming behind her, the scarf at her neck fluttering wildly. Emery could see the tight set of her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the reins, not afraid but focused, determined. Then a cry, a sharp bark from the trail behind. Birch. Followed by a thud. Emery pulled up hard. Birch lay on the side of the trail, limp, a smear of red on the snow. One of Eckhart's men, the one who'd flanked, stood over him, raising his gun toward Emery. Before he could pull the trigger, Emery fired. The man dropped. His rifle clattered to stone. Emery dropped from his horse, slid to the dog's side. Birch was breathing, but barely. His eyes opened, saw Emery, and gave a faint whine. "I'm sorry, old boy," Emery whispered, his hand trembling as it pressed over the wound. You did good. You always did. Behind him, hooves again. One rider. Best. Emery stood. Eckhart rode in, pulling up short a few yards away. His horse snorted steam. He stepped down slowly, methodically, like he was about to make a speech. "You're not going to get away," Eckhart said, tone casual. Emery raised his rifle. "She already has." Eckhart smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She's a contract, Cade. A well-paid one. You think this is about love or choice? It's about obligation. She belongs. She belongs nowhere but where she chooses to be." Eckhart's smile faltered. "You think dying for her will make her free?" Emery's voice was low. "I'm not dying today." And then, behind Eckhart, hooves again. Isolde. She'd circled back. She didn't yell. She didn't warn. She just rode hard, fast, straight into Eckhart. The horse collided with his side, knocking him off balance. Emery rushed forward. Eckhart rolled, drawing his pistol, firing once, missed. Emery dropped low, swung the butt of his rifle into Eckhart's hand. Bone cracked. The gun skittered into the snow. They fought then, not with honor but with fury. Eckhart was trained, but Emery fought like a man who'd lost too much to lose again. He tackled him into the snow, fists landing hard. Blood spattered. Eckhart reached for a knife. Isolde dismounted, grabbed the gun from the snow, raised it. "Stop," she said. Both men froze. She aimed the weapon, steady hands, steady eyes. She didn't tremble. "You can go back," she told Eckhart. "Alone. You can tell them what you like. But I am done being chased." Eckhart spat blood. "You won't make it. The world out there doesn't want your kind." She didn't blink. "Then I'll make a new world." He looked at her, then at Emery, then laughed once, bitter. "She's not worth dying for." Emery's voice was gravel. "Then it's a good thing I'm not dying." Eckhart lay back in the snow, breath wheezing. "I'll leave. This time. But someone else will come. You can't bury who she is." Isolde stepped forward. "We're not burying it. We're building on it." She turned, walked to Emery, and helped him to his feet. He leaned into her slightly, blood on his lip, ribs aching. "You all right?" she asked. "I'll live," he said, eyes warm with pain and love. "What about Birch?" She swallowed. I think he's gone." Emery's face broke, just a little, but he nodded. "He stayed long enough." Together, they mounted and rode. Eckhart didn't follow. The trail bent south. The wind shifted. The world turned gold around them. They reached Stillwater Ridge by nightfall, just as the first stars blinked into being. The town was quiet, unremarkable, just scattered rooftops and a church steeple leaning slightly west. But it was theirs to walk into, together. They found an old trading post at the edge of town, its windows fogged, its porch sagging. The woman who ran it didn't ask their names, only gave them keys and bread. That night, Emery sat beside the hearth, his shoulder bandaged, a fire flickering low. Isolde curled beside him, head on his chest, her breath soft and even. Neither spoke for a long while. Then she said, "Do you think we're safe now?" Emery looked at the fire. "No," he said honestly. "But I think we're free." She smiled. "That's better." He kissed her forehead. "Tomorrow, we'll get you new papers. A new name." She shook her head. "No. No more names. Just me, this time." And in the quiet that followed, something like peace settled over them. Hard-earned. True. Outside, snow began again, soft this time, gentle. Inside, two hearts beat steady against the dark. And somewhere, in a world that would never truly understand them, they had chosen each other. And that was enough. Snow fell like ash over the high plains, slow and soundless, turning the earth into a white oblivion. Trees stood as thin sentinels in the dusk, their limbs clawing at the gray sky, bark flaking like old skin. Somewhere between the pines, a man moved, quiet as a ghost, his coat heavy with frost, his breath rising in little clouds that vanished before they could warm the world. Eli Coulter had lived alone for 2 winters now. Not the kind of alone that just meant solitude, but the kind that wrapped around a man's bones and stayed there, thick and settled, like smoke in the rafters. He didn't talk to himself. Didn't drink. Didn't much pray, though once, long ago, he believed in something higher than wind and rot. His wife, Florence, had passed under snow like this, taken by a fever that came quick and mean. One day she was singing to the chickens, the next she was ash beneath the frozen cottonwood. After that, Eli let the silence grow wild inside him. He walked now because it was all he knew to do. The deer had gone low to feed, and the snares he'd set along the ridge needed checking. He moved steady through the trees, boots creaking over the crust of ice. The sky was bleeding into twilight, and the cold held sharp teeth. That was when he heard it, first like wind, then like something sharper. A cry. A child's cry. Not near, but not far either. Eli froze. He turned toward the sound, his body tightening the way a wolf does before the leap. There was no mistaking it. Not a bird. Not an echo. A child, and panicked. Without thinking, he left the path. His rifle was slung across his back, but his hands stayed free. The snow deepened as he moved down the slope, catching on underbrush, wetting his cuffs. The sound came again, closer now. A high-pitched scream, cut off too quick. He reached a clearing and stopped so suddenly his breath caught. There, not 30 paces ahead, was a woman pulling 2 girls against her. She had a stick in one hand, a useless thing, and the look of a mother ready to throw herself teeth first at anything that came near. Her coat was too thin. The girls clung to her skirts, wide-eyed and shaking. Behind them, 3 wolves circled low and slow, gaunt, dirty things, their ribs pushing through fur like ridges under cloth. Hungry, desperate. Eli moved without speaking, raised the rifle, fired once, clean, into the air. The wolves scattered at the shot, yelping, crashing through brush like shadows breaking apart. Only one turned back to look, its eyes catching the fading light, yellow and resentful. Then they were gone. The silence that followed was heavier than the shot. The woman didn't move. Her shoulders remained hunched, her arms wrapped around the children like they were still in danger. One of the girls began to cry. Quiet, breathless sobs. Eli stepped forward slowly, his voice low as winter rain. "Come with me. You won't make it through the night out here." She didn't answer. Just watched him like he was another wolf, a quieter one maybe, but still wild. "I've got shelter. Food." Still no reply. But the smaller girl reached toward him with a trembling hand, and that was enough. They followed him. No one spoke. The snow rose around their boots like memory, and the sky deepened to violet. Eli led them up the trail, through a line of pines heavy with white. The wind picked up, slipping under clothes, finding skin. The cabin came into view like something carved into the earth, wooden, dark, half-buried in drifts. Smoke rose from the chimney, soft and straight. Inside, the warmth hit them in the chest like a living thing. A fire burned steady in the hearth. Blankets were piled near the stove. The scent of stew lingered from earlier, rich with thyme and bone. Eli gestured for them to sit near the fire. The woman hesitated, then led the girls forward. She moved like someone unused to softness, as if warmth might be another trap. Eli didn't press her. He took down 3 tin cups and filled them with warm broth. One of the girls, older, maybe 9, whispered something in her mother's ear, then accepted the cup with both hands. The younger one, perhaps 6, curled up beside the fire, eyelids heavy. The woman finally spoke, voice dry as fallen leaves. "Thank you." Her name, she said after a long pause, was Mary Lou Walsh. Her husband had died on the trail west, drowned crossing a river swollen with meltwater. She'd tried to make it to Silver Ridge, where there were rumors of work and a school. The cart broke down 3 days back. They'd been walking since. The wolves came that morning. Eli nodded once. He understood that kind of story. Knew how easily it could have been him lying cold in some river while Florence tried to drag her way through the wilderness alone. "You can stay the night," he said, and the words came with a strange weight. Not just duty. Not just kindness. Something deeper, older. Mary looked at her daughters. Then at him. Just one night. He didn't argue. Didn't need to. That night passed slow and strange. The wind howled outside, pressing against the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled, and the girls slept curled up like pups beneath one of Florence's old quilts. Mary didn't sleep much. She kept watch, her eyes flickering open every hour. Eli saw her silhouette in the firelight and thought she looked like a woman carved from grief and grit, still standing somehow, still shielding her young. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Everything important had already been said without speaking. In the morning, he made biscuits and fried salt pork. The girls ate like they hadn't seen food in days. Mary didn't touch her plate at first. Just watched them with something sharp and soft tangled in her gaze. Eli offered her coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his for half a second. It felt like the first real touch he'd had in years. She looked around the cabin then, properly. Her eyes lingered on the shelf of books, the saddle by the door, the woven rug Florence had made. Nothing was out of place, but nothing was joyful either. A lived-in space with no laughter. She asked, "Where's your family?" "Gone," he said. His voice didn't shake. Later, as she gathered their things, he said nothing. Just stood on the porch, watching the wind stir the trees. The girls clung to her skirts again. She thanked him once more, quieter this time. Then she turned to go. It wasn't pride that stopped him. It was the way the youngest looked back at the cabin, her face drawn and tired, hope flickering behind her exhaustion like the end of a candle. "You'll freeze by nightfall," Eli said, still looking at the trees. She didn't turn. "I've done worse," she replied. He said nothing, just stepped aside and let them pass. But an hour later, as he walked the ridge again, he saw the prints in the snow. Small ones. Sharp. Wolf tracks, following human ones. He cursed under his breath and turned back. He found them a mile out. The snow deeper, the girls slower, Mary's coat stiff with cold. The wolves hadn't struck yet, but they were near. Close enough that Eli could feel their hunger vibrating in the stillness. This time, he didn't ask. He simply reached out his hand. She looked at it, then at her girls, then took it. Back at the cabin, the fire roared higher than before. Eli tossed more wood into it, not for heat, but for reassurance. Mary sat without protest this time. The girls moved slower now, their fear receding into weariness. And Eli, he sat too, not apart, but near. Outside, the wolves circled again, unseen, unwelcome. But inside, something had shifted. 4 souls beneath one roof, the snow still falling. And for the first time in 2 long winters, the silence didn't feel so hollow. The days that followed settled like fresh snow, soft, slow, without sound. Nothing dramatic happened, not at first. But it was in that hush, that winter stillness, that the quiet things began to take root. Mary Lou didn't ask to stay. Eli didn't offer. But neither mentioned leaving. They simply lived, hour by hour, task by task, as if survival itself had rewritten their understanding of time. Each morning, Eli rose before light, fed the livestock, split wood with the rhythm of someone who knew how to move without thought. Mary started cooking before the cabin warmed, her hands red with cold as she kneaded bread dough in Eli's wide mixing bowl. She never asked where the flour came from, never questioned the provisions. Just used what was there, grateful for the tools, intent on earning the space she occupied. She had always been that way, she said once. Never wanted to take more than she gave. Pride, perhaps. Or a habit formed too young, from too many miles walked without help. Her daughters, Lila and June, adjusted in fits and starts. Lila, the elder by 3 years, kept close to Mary's side, watchful and quiet. She seemed older than her age, a small shadow of her mother's strength. June, on the other hand, was made of lighter things. Curious, bright-eyed, quick to giggle if ever given a reason. One morning, as Eli fixed the broken hinge on the back door, June wandered up behind him and plopped herself in the dirt beside his boot. She didn't speak, just watched. When he noticed, he handed her a loose nail. "Hold it straight," he said. She did. Crookedly, but she did. It became a quiet kind of ritual. June hovered near Eli whenever he worked outdoors. She followed him to the woodpile, sat on the porch while he sharpened blades. She didn't ask many questions, but her eyes absorbed everything, as if memorizing his movements might unlock some unspoken magic. Mary watched these moments from the window. She never interrupted. But something softened in her face when she saw them, something she quickly tucked away. There were still distances between them. Silences that weren't yet comfortable, just empty. Eli didn't pry into Mary's past. She didn't ask about Florence. The names of the dead lived in the walls but didn't pass between lips. Instead, they spoke in small exchanges. "Could use a hand with this. I've got stew warming. Your girl's caught a chill. Let her rest." The cold clung hard that week, days barely rising above freezing. Icicles grew long along the eaves, and the wind clawed through the pines with a voice that sounded like regret. They kept the fire fed constantly. The cabin, though snug, became their world. Eli noticed how Mary moved, efficient, no wasted energy. She washed clothes with sleeves rolled high, arms knotted with muscle built from hardship, not luxury. When she stirred soup, she kept one eye on the girls, as if any second might turn against her. She didn't laugh often, but when she did, usually at something June muttered half under her breath, it was a low, surprised sound, like someone remembering how to exhale. She was not soft in the ways Florence had been. Not gentle in speech, nor warm by default. But there was a steadiness to her, a solid grace. Eli found himself watching her hands more often than he meant to. She noticed, once. He looked away. The girls began to play again, just little things. Drawing shapes in the frost on the window. Pretending their bread crusts were horses. Lila found an old deck of cards in the cupboard and tried to teach June how to play war. Their laughter, quiet and sporadic, filled spaces that had echoed for too long. On the third evening, Mary took down Eli's stew pot without asking, then added rosemary and onions and made something that filled the room with warmth deeper than heat. Eli sat at the table, carving a block of pine into what might have been a horse or a bear. He wasn't sure yet. She didn't sit until the girls were fed and quiet. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee and joined him, not across the table, but beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "That's a fox," she said. He raised an eyebrow. She grinned. "Sort of. Has the look of something clever and always tired." He chuckled, a low rumble, then nodded. "I'll take it." They didn't speak more. But something passed between them, an ease that hadn't existed before. A truce, perhaps, or the start of one. Later that night, as Eli brought in more wood, he saw her on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. She didn't flinch when he stepped beside her. "My husband, he was sweet," she said quietly. "Loved my girls like breath. But he didn't plan ahead. Every day felt like walking on a thread stretched thin." Eli said nothing. "I don't miss being alone on the trail. I miss him. But I don't miss that life." He nodded, slow. "Florence had a garden," he said, almost surprised by his own voice. She sang to it, called each plant by name. When she died, nothing grew the spring after. Mary didn't speak, just looked at the stars a little longer. The next day, she swept the cabin without being asked. She mended a torn curtain, tucked the girls in after breakfast, and scrubbed the floor until it smelled like pine. Eli returned from checking the traps to find his home cleaner than it had been in months. Mary was standing at the sink, humming under her breath. Not a song he knew, but it made the air feel warmer somehow. He didn't thank her, just picked up the pot and stirred the stew. She didn't expect thanks. That was part of what he was beginning to understand. That evening, June brought him a small braid of yarn and said it was a lasso for his carved fox. He took it like it was a gift of gold. Lila, always cautious, just watched him with those solemn eyes. She would need time. Mary joined him outside the next morning while he chopped kindling. She didn't say anything at first, just picked up a small hatchet and started splitting alongside him. She was clumsy, but she didn't stop. He handed her a sturdier log, adjusted her stance. His hands lingered on her elbows, guiding. "Better," he said. She nodded, determined. They worked in tandem until the pile doubled. He didn't know why the sight of her hair pulled back with twine stirred something in his chest, but it did. Later, she let him braid Lila's hair, awkwardly, with large hands and too much tension. Lila sat still anyway. The world outside stayed frozen, but inside, something was thawing. One night, a storm raged louder than any yet. Snow blew sideways against the windows. Trees groaned in the wind. Mary pulled the girls into the big bed near the fire. They didn't want to sleep apart. Eli started toward the other cot, then paused. "You can stay," she said, her voice low. "The girls are used to closeness. Safer that way." He hesitated only a moment, then lay down beside them, still dressed, arms crossed over his chest. The fire flickered against the ceiling. June rolled onto his arm sometime near midnight. Lila curled tighter into her mother. Eli stared at the ceiling, unmoving, as warmth and breath filled the space around him like something sacred. In the morning, the storm had passed. The trees stood stiff in new snow, glinting under pale sun. Mary stood at the doorway, holding a steaming mug, her hair loose, her expression unreadable. The girls were still asleep. Eli stirred the embers to life again. "We'll need more kindling," he murmured. She nodded. "We've still got time before spring." It wasn't a deflorenciation, or even a promise. Just a recognition that whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth keeping warm. The snow began to soften with the passing days. Not enough to speak of spring, not yet, but enough to carry the smell of wet earth and cedar bark when the wind shifted. It changed how sound traveled, too. The woods no longer swallowed footsteps whole. You could hear the drip from the eaves, the caw of a solitary crow, the creak of trees stretching under their frozen weight. Inside the cabin, the rhythm between four souls continued to form. Not fast, not loud, but sure, like the stitching of a careful seam. Eli had stopped waiting for the morning when Mary and her girls would gather their things and disappear back into the landscape. He no longer glanced at the coat pegs wondering which would empty first. He simply lived, among them, beside them, as though they had always been there. Mary noticed. She noticed everything. He'd never been a man of words, but he made space for them in other ways. He moved quietly through the house so the girls could sleep longer. He carved little wooden animals that appeared, one by one, on the windowsill. He filled the pantry with flour and salt without ever announcing the trip into town. He did not ask Mary what her plans were. He did not need to. In the quiet hour between supper and sleep, Mary began to hum again. Not always, not every night, but more and more. Sometimes it was the tune her mother had sung during laundry days. Other times it was nothing at all, just sound for the sake of having one. Eli listened without letting her see. He thought it was the kind of sound people made when they forgot they were afraid. One morning, Mary found him outside mending the corral fence, sleeves rolled to the elbow, shirt damp with effort. She walked up holding a cup of hot chicory and said, flatly, "You're wasting your strength." He glanced at her, puzzled. That fence was leaning before the frost came. Ain't no point in fixing something that's ready to fall. He wiped his brow. "You think it's better to let it fall?" "I think it's better to build new when the time's right." She handed him the cup, and when their fingers brushed, he didn't move away. She didn't either. She started helping after that, not just cooking and cleaning, but real help, the kind that meant something. She learned to hitch the mule, though she cursed more than she led. She chopped wood straighter now, even if her hands blistered. She helped birth a lamb one cold dusk while Eli held the lantern, her face calm, her hands steady, her voice low and sure. Later that night, as the fire cracked and the girls slept beneath a quilt they all now shared, Eli sat beside her at the table, holding a mug that had long gone cold. "You did good today," he said. Mary blinked slowly. "I've always known how to survive. It's everything else I never learned right." Eli didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant to live a whole life guarding your own heart like it was something too fragile to spend. The girls were blooming. Lila read through the old books Florence had left behind. Stories of prairie lands, fairy queens, and brave little girls who outsmarted wolves and giants alike. June kept to Eli like a second shadow, mimicking his stride, his size, even the way he looked at the horizon before speaking. He didn't know how it happened, exactly, how his name had shifted from Mr. Coulter to just Eli in their mouths. But he remembered the first time June said it like it had always belonged to her. "Eli, look, I made you a fox baby." She held out a lump of knotted yarn with tiny twig legs. It was hideous. It was perfect. He placed it beside the carved fox on the shelf. Said nothing more than, "Thank you." One evening, the four of them sat on the porch. The sky was gold-flecked and low. Mary rocked slowly in Florence's old chair, eyes half-lidded. Lila leaned against her, half asleep. June sat on the steps beside Eli, threading grass through her fingers. Mary's voice broke the hush. "You ever think about leaving here?" Eli glanced sideways. "Not lately." She nodded, quiet for a moment. "I used to think I'd keep moving until something felt right. But I'm beginning to think right doesn't come from the road." Eli didn't answer, but he let his hand fall to June's head, resting there like a promise. Later that night, Mary rose from her bed and walked to the hearth where he sat carving again. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him and watched the curls of wood fall to the floor. She said, "My first home was with a man who loved me, but didn't know how to protect us. My second was on the road. I don't think I've ever really had a third." He laid down the carving knife, looked at her fully. "Maybe you do now." It wasn't a grand moment. No music. No sudden embrace. Just a breath between them, stretched and steady, like the pause before spring. After that, the space between them changed. Mary began hanging her washing on the line behind the cabin, not just near the door like she used to. She found Florence's old herb pots and filled them with soil, pressing seeds down with thumb and hope. One day, Eli found her humming beside the stove, the scent of roasted apples thick in the air. The windows fogged with warmth. "You planning a feast?" he asked. She shrugged, smiling faintly. "I just like the smell. Makes the girls think the world's sweeter than it is." He nodded, watching her. "Maybe it is." The next morning, she packed a basket with bread, jerky, and cheese. Said they were going to the river. The girls squealed with delight. Eli, surprised, followed them anyway. They hiked down to the bend where the ice was thinning, and the sun touched everything with honey light. Lila picked stones. June chased shadows. Mary sat on a flat rock with her boots off, toes wiggling in the sun, eyes closed. Eli watched them and felt something unfamiliar crack open inside him. Not longing. Not guilt. Just the quiet ache of something being returned. They stayed all day. Said little. But when they walked back, June took his hand without asking. That night, with the girls asleep and the fire reduced to glowing coals, Mary turned to him. "This isn't how I thought my life would turn out." "Me neither," he said. "But it feels more right than anything I ever had." He didn't touch her. Didn't need to. Their words were touch enough. There was no kiss that night. Just stillness and closeness and breath shared across inches. Then, one morning, Mary opened the door to find a letter tucked into the woodpile. "From your brother, Eli," she said, frowning. He took the envelope slowly. The handwriting was tight and judgmental. He read in silence, then burned the letter in the stove. "Bad news?" Mary asked. "Just noise," he said. She didn't press. But that night, he sat longer by the fire. His jaw tight, his hands clenched. Mary moved to the table and laid a hand over his. "If there's something I need to know." "There isn't." Then he added, softer, "But there's something coming. Family." They don't understand what this is. She studied him a moment, then nodded. Let them come, she said. He looked at her then, truly looked, and felt something settle. Let them come, he repeated. That night, he couldn't sleep. The fire crackled low. He watched the ceiling as the girls murmured in dreams and Mary turned softly beside him. Eventually, he whispered into the dark, I've chosen this. And in her sleep, she reached for his hand. He let her find it. Outside, the frost was lifting. The wolves hadn't been back in weeks. And still, something in Eli kept watch, because he knew peace had a way of drawing challenge. But he also knew something else now. Not everything had to be earned with pain. Some things, like belonging, could arrive as quiet as snow and stay. The thaw had started to take hold, seeping quietly into the roots and riverbeds, loosening the land from winter's grip. Where there had been only snow, tufts of last summer's grass now peeked through like old memories reawakening. Chickens scratched at the softened earth again. The mule stomped with livelier hooves. A breeze came that smelled faintly of wet bark and ash. It was on one such wind that the first sign arrived. A pair of riders at the ridge, pausing beneath the cottonwoods like doubt hesitating before it speaks. Eli saw them from the far field, one tall and stiff in the saddle, the other hunched, younger. His heart knew before his eyes confirmed it. He leaned against the fence, hands wrapped around the post, watching their figures grow sharper. The taller man dismounted slowly, deliberately, as if ceremony alone lent weight to his presence. Amos Coulter. Older by 3 years. Eli's brother. Family in name, though not in warmth. Eli stayed still as they approached, waiting for the inevitable. Amos stopped a few paces away, brushing dust from his jacket like it might redeem the wear of the ride. Been a while, Eli. Eli nodded. Thought maybe that was the point. The younger man, Tommy, a cousin by marriage, barely 20, looked at the cabin with wide eyes. His gaze caught on the small figure of June running barefoot through the yard, on Mary bent over the herb beds, sleeves rolled and hair catching light like a flame. This it? Amos asked, voice flat. This what's kept you hidden all winter? Eli didn't answer. There was no need. Amos exhaled sharply, scorn tightening his jaw. The ranch is still half yours. The north pasture needs repair. And Pa's grave needs tending. You belong to more than this. Eli looked past him, toward the cabin, where June now skipped in a circle, humming to herself. Mary raised her head, sensing something, her body stilling. I belong where I'm needed, he said simply. Amos shook his head, laughing dryly. You're playing house with a settler's widow and her orphans. You think that's purpose? I think it's peace. Peace? Amos's voice rose. You've let a stranger crawl into Florence's bed, Eli. Into your name. You really think Pa would bless that? Florence is gone, Eli said, quiet but steady. And Pa never blessed much of anything that made a man happy. Tommy shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Inside the cabin, Mary had gathered the girls. She stood in the doorway now, back straight, arms at her sides. She didn't interrupt, didn't call out. She simply watched, unreadable. Amos followed Eli's gaze. She's using you. Just look at her, eyes too sharp, hands too eager. She's got you soft already, feeding your loneliness so you don't notice what's being taken. Eli's jaw tightened. You're wrong. Amos stepped closer. I'm trying to save you from making a mistake you'll regret until your last breath. I already regret the years I spent thinking like you, Eli said. A long silence followed. Wind stirred the bare branches. A bird called once, then fell quiet. Amos didn't speak again. He simply turned, mounted, and rode off without a backward glance. Tommy hesitated, his eyes lingering on Mary, then Eli, before following. Eli stood still for a long while. The sun passed behind a thin veil of cloud, and the world cooled by degrees. Mary approached quietly. That was family, wasn't it? He nodded. You're shaking, she said. He looked down at his hands. He was. She touched his wrist. Not to comfort, just to anchor. He turned to her, eyes rimmed in weariness. They think you're here to bleed me dry. She didn't flinch. Then let them think it. He took a breath. They think I'm betraying what I had with Florence. Mary looked away, jaw tense. Am I? She didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, grief doesn't end with new love. It just learns how to walk beside it. He closed his eyes. Inside, the girls sat at the table, whispering. June clutched a wooden rabbit Eli had carved. Lila was watching through the window, her face blank, her thoughts too old for her age. Mary moved to gather her things that evening. She did it gently, deliberately, without tears. Eli found her packing dried goods into the old leather satchel. You don't have to leave, he said. She didn't look at him. I know. He stepped closer. Then why are you doing it? Because I won't let them think you've been fooled. And I won't let you carry my weight like it's penance. It's not a weight, he said. To them, it is. He didn't argue. But he reached down and took the satchel from her hands. She stared at him. Don't make me walk away again, she said softly. I've done that enough for one lifetime. Then don't. He set the satchel aside. Not with force, just finality. He knelt before her daughters, who'd been standing silent in the doorway, clinging to one another. He looked June in the eye. Your mama saved my life when she let me belong to something again. He looked at Lila. And you, when you sit by the fire reading, you fill this cabin with something I thought I'd lost forever. He turned to Mary. Let them talk, he said. Let them scowl from their barns and their pulpits. I've chosen this. I've chosen you. She stared at him for a long, still moment. Then, slowly, her shoulders released the weight she'd held too long. She stepped forward and placed her forehead against his, eyes closed. I'm tired of running, she whispered. Then stay. That night, the cabin glowed with lamplight and bread baking in the hearth. Mary braided Lila's hair by the fire. Eli mended a torn hem on June's doll, thread catching clumsily in his large fingers. No one spoke of the riders. The tension had passed like a brief, violent storm. And outside, the wolves did not come. A week later, Eli found a sack of corn seed left at the fence line. No note. No signature. Just a quiet concession. Mary planted them the next day, humming beneath her breath. The wind softened against the cabin walls. And Eli, he watched her, the curve of her back, the patience of her hands, the fire in her spirit, and knew with certainty. What they had wasn't a mistake. It wasn't shame. It was a kind of salvation the world rarely witnessed. And no voice, bitter or not, would take it from him. Spring arrived not all at once, but in careful stages. First with the silver thaw running down the eaves, then the deep drip-drip from the pines, and finally, with the stubborn rise of green pushing up through the old snow. The land no longer held its breath. The birds returned, calling loud from branches that only weeks ago groaned under ice. Even the wind lost its bite. At the edge of the cabin, Eli watched his land stir back to life. Sap ran in the trees. The hens clucked with new purpose. The mule, shaggy and spoiled, stood with an almost smug patience while June braided wildflowers into its mane. She had named him Luther. Eli didn't know why. He didn't ask. Inside, Mary baked without needing a reason. The cabin, once solemn and spare, now smelled of cinnamon, wood smoke, and bread. She'd scrubbed the windows clean, hung new curtains she'd sewn by hand, and planted a row of herbs in coffee tins along the windowsill. The space no longer mourned Florence. It remembered her, yes, but gently, like a photograph fading in sunlight, not a wound. She laughed more now, and not just the careful kind, but the real, unguarded laugh that tipped her head back and crinkled the corners of her eyes. Her daughters bloomed alongside her. Lila had taken to reading aloud, her voice steady and sharp as flint, while June collected stories from the wind and turned them into long, rambling fables that never ended where they began. And Eli, who once measured his days in silence, began to speak again. Not often, and never loudly, but with a kind of calm certainty that only comes from having chosen a life and finding, against all odds, that it loves you back. But peace, however sturdy, always draws its test. It was nearly dusk when the wagon came, creaking up the long trail in a cloud of dust and axle groans. Mary was in the garden, pulling weeds with dirt under her nails and a smudge across her cheek. Eli stood near the shed, sharpening the scythe. The girls were playing in the grass, barefoot and loud. Eli straightened as soon as he heard the wheels. They came with purpose, 3 men, Amos again riding at the head, his face like carved oak, and 2 others from town. One was the preacher from Pine Hollow. The other a lawyer Eli recognized from his father's estate dealings. This wasn't a social visit. Eli moved to meet them. He didn't call to Mary, but she saw, rising to her feet with her jaw tight, the garden trowel still in hand. Amos climbed down first. His boots crunched on gravel. His eyes swept over the yard, the girls, then Eli. "You've had your time, brother. Now I'm here on business." Eli folded his arms. "A complaint's been lodged," Amos continued, "about the suitability of this household. About the children, about Mary, about you." "Suitability," Eli echoed. "Like we're furniture." Amos didn't flinch. "You've forgotten yourself. Forgotten what a name means in these parts. What duty looks like." The preacher stepped forward, his tone oily with forced sympathy. "We just want to make sure the children are in a stable environment. A woman like her, well, she has no claim to this land. No legal ties. No marriage license." Mary stepped closer then, hands clenched at her sides. She didn't speak, not yet, but her eyes flared with heat. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Coulter, if you refuse to address the matter properly, we'll be forced to raise the issue with the court. We have others willing to take the girls. Good families. Proper homes." Eli stepped forward. June was clinging to Mary's skirt now. Lila stood behind her sister, eyes narrowed, jaw trembling. "This is their home," Eli said. "It's not borrowed. It's not charity. It's earned. Every corner, every beam. We built this life together." Without legal standing, the lawyer began. "I'll marry her now," Eli said. "Today." The words fell like a stone into water, quiet, but with ripples that stretched to every soul standing. Mary blinked, once. Eli turned to her fully. "I was going to wait for a softer day. A quieter time. But they don't get to define what we are." "I do. You do." Mary swallowed, something wild and fragile flickering across her face. Then, without breaking his gaze, she took off her glove, reached into her apron, and held out something small. The ring was simple. Silver, plain, hers once from her mother's locket. She placed it in his hand, her fingers brushing his palm. "Do it right," she said. "But do it now." The preacher gaped. "That's not how this works." "It is now," Eli said, turning. "Because I say so. And if you've forgotten, this land is mine. This house is mine. And the law never once kept me warm in winter or made a girl laugh at the table." The preacher blustered. The lawyer turned to Amos, uncertain. But Amos just looked at his brother, something old and bitter dying in his eyes. "You'll regret this." "No," Eli said. "I regret nothing that led me here." The preacher, caught in the moment, stumbled through the vows. It wasn't neat. It wasn't proper. But it was real. Mary said yes like she was staking her life on it. Eli said yes like a man who'd been waiting his whole life to speak. When it was done, the girls clapped. June danced in a circle. Lila, solemn as always, stepped forward and hugged Eli's waist without a word. The preacher climbed into the wagon, flustered and red-faced. The lawyer followed. Amos mounted last, his mouth a tight line. But before he rode off, he left something on the porch, a sack of grain and a jar of pickled beets. A small offering. Not apology, but something close. The sun sank behind the hills as the wagon disappeared down the trail. Inside, Mary moved through the cabin like someone remembering it anew. Her fingers brushed the mantel. Her shoulders were different now, not heavier, but certain. Eli stood at the window, watching the dusk deepen. Then he turned, walked to her, and pulled her close. Not urgently, just wholly. Later, with the girls asleep and the fire casting long shadows on the floor, they sat together at the table, hands entwined. "You still want to build that new fence?" she asked, teasing. He smiled. "Only if you help me pick the wood." She leaned into his shoulder. "We're not hiding anymore." "No," he said. "We're living." Outside, a lone wolf stood at the edge of the clearing. Not near. Not threatening. Just watching, yellow eyes calm beneath the moonlight. And then, as if understanding something sacred had been marked and claimed, it turned and melted into the woods without a sound. The light in the cabin stayed on long after the fire dimmed, glowing like a lantern against the dark, like a promise held in steady hands. Here, where love had not rushed but rooted, where silence had made space for belonging, this was the place where the light stayed. And no storm, no bitter voice, no shadow from the past would take it. Not now. Not ever.